The highway narrowed until it didn't feel like a highway at all, just a pale ribbon laid across the desert, patched in places where rain had gnawed at the shoulders and sun had blistered the top. Claire Whitmore kept her hands steady at 10 and 2, knuckles pale against the steering wheel, the AC laboring to push back heat that seeped through the glass like breath. 50 miles out from town, the radio gave up to static, and with it, any distraction she might have leaned on for the last stretch. That was fine. She hadn't come back to be comforted. Her brother's name, the one etched on the county death certificate, the one whispered on a voicemail from a neighbor she hadn't saved, rode shotgun all the same. Accident, they'd said. A tire blew on the old work truck. The vehicle fishtailed, struck a culvert, flipped, quick as lightning, clean as paperwork. She tried to picture it the way medics are trained to picture scenes. Angles, speed, surfaces, force, survivable versus not. She didn't picture his face. She didn't risk it. The turnoff came with no fanfare, a faded green sign leaning on a rotted post, and a gate that had sagged so long it looked as if the earth had grown tired of holding it up. She rolled to a stop in the powder-dry gravel, stepped out, and heat slammed her chest like a door. The metal latch burned her palm. She set the gate wide with the grunt of someone pulling a stubborn tooth and drove through slowly, trailing a ribbon of dust that twisted behind her in the hot breeze. The ranch appeared in stages, as if embarrassed to be seen all at once. First the windmill stalled, blades rusted to a reddish black, a hawk perched on the tail. Then the house, low and weather-beaten, paint stripped to gray boards, where white had tried and failed to hold on. Fences had sagged, barbed wire swaying like tired smiles. Tumbleweeds had camped out along the corrals, pressed against rails as if trying to get in. The pasture was more memory than grass, bare patches stitched together by stubborn mesquite that had crept inward like an invading army. She parked beside the porch and killed the engine. Silence leapt forward. Not true silence. There was always sound out here if you listened, but the kind that hummed from every direction and refused to be named. Heat sang. A grasshopper ticked. Somewhere a wind loosened a nail and set it to clicking. Claire stood with the keys still in her hand and let it all spread over her like a heavy blanket. 12 years, she thought. 12 years, and nothing here had the courtesy to be different enough to absolve her. The front steps flexed under her weight. A nail snagged her boot. The screen door was off its spring and drooped open like a yawn. Inside, dust had all the best seats. On the table beneath a stack of unopened flyers, along the stair rail. In the sink where a spider had strung a net that made a harp when she brushed by. She clicked the lights out of habit and got nothing. The meter had probably been pulled years ago. She opened every window and propped the back door with the heel of her boot until the desert's slow breath began to move through the rooms. She took inventory the way she used to in the field. Quick, practical, impersonal. Pantry, mouse droppings, a bag of flour gone to clumps. 3 jars of peaches someone's wife had canned and left for them in the era when hope had been the main spice. Refrigerator, dead as a boulder and twice as useful. The sink coughed when she tried the tap and finally gave her a thread of brown water that cleared to something clear enough to rinse a face, not to drink. On the counter lay a ceramic mug with a cracked handle and a pen with her brother's insurance company printed on it. She touched neither, the way you don't touch a wound until you have to. By late afternoon, sweat had made an honest worker of her. She swept until she raised her own weather system, rolled up the old rug and carried it out, found the broom closet door swollen from some long-ago storm and shouldered it open, pulled a crate of tools to the porch for tomorrow's triage. In the bedroom that used to be hers, she found the bed stripped, the mattress leaning against a wall like someone trying to stand after bad news. She put it back down and chose the porch anyway. Sun set in stages, the front yard long shadowed into blue, the sky going copper, then rose, then the kind of clean, pale white that promises stars. Claire pulled a camp chair into a corner where the boards still felt solid. She set her boots on the rail and her back to a pillar and took her first breath of the evening as if she'd been underwater all day. Out over the corrals, the desert made its shift. Day things went quiet. Night things tuned up. A coyote threw out a note, tested the air, tried again. Another answered, closer than she liked. Too close to the house for a property that had once been busy with dogs and people and light. She counted the seconds between calls like she used to count heartbeats. The guilt didn't come like a wave. It had been here when she turned off the highway. It had been here when she rolled the mattress down. It had been here when she took the first step onto the porch. It came like heat, constant, unarguable, fatiguing. She let it do what it would. She had done the things she'd sworn she wouldn't do when she left at 26 with a duffel bag, a new Army ID, and a spine full of stubborn. She had stayed away. The last words to her brother had been a hard goodbye in the drive. The kind you throw over your shoulder because you're afraid to look back. He'd shouted something about quitting on family. She'd shouted something about not being a ranch nurse for the rest of her life. Words sharp enough to stick, not sharp enough to cut free. A small thing snapped in the yard and made her jolt. Just a brittle twig, no weight to it, carried under one boot by a jackrabbit that froze mid-hop, ears high and dark against the yard's pale. She exhaled and smiled without joy. Far off, a train laid down its long, lonesome note. Close by, wood shifted and let go a tired groan. The windmill gave a single, rusted click as the night wind changed. She let the sounds build a map in her head, the way she would on patrol in the black. Where things were, how they moved, how they might move next. When full dark came, the stars felt more crowded than she remembered. The Milky Way dragged itself across the roofline like someone hauling a net full of white fish. She set a lantern on the boards and turned the knob until the mantle glowed the color of old bones. Moths arrived as if summoned. She found herself listening for hoofbeats and shook her head at the superstition. This place had always made a church of the animals because the people weren't enough on their own. Still, her ear kept cocking toward the corrals, and once she thought she saw a darker shape among the dark rails, motionless, squared to her. It was nothing. It was everything she didn't yet have words for. A gust came low over the pasture and tumbled a giant weed into the side of the house with a thump, then sent it spinning along the porch until it wedged against the steps. She got up to kick it aside and found, at the porch's edge, the top strand of fence wire had broken and curled like a lazy snake. The staple that had held it to the post had pulled free, leaving a little silver mouth where wood had been. She stepped into the yard to fix it, and the ground clicked underfoot. The rattles came from the base of the step, a warning more vibration than sound, a buzz that went straight to bone. She froze, scanned, picked out the shape, and stepped back in a slow arc until she could reach the long-handled hoe leaning by the door. She eased it down between the snake and the step and gave the boards a little rattle. The snake chose the yard, uncoiling with slow dignity and moving toward the mesquite. She let the breath go she hadn't known she was holding and propped the broken wire against the post for tomorrow. She slept only in pockets. Coyotes talked and quit. An owl stitched a line of soft sounds across the dark. Somewhere after midnight, a truck labored along the highway. The faint throb of diesel, then gone. She woke to her own name once, a trick of wind through the door, and kept her eyes closed until the urge to answer passed. When she finally slid into real sleep, it came without pictures, as if her mind had decided she'd had enough of those for one day. Dawn began as a rumor, the sky over the eastern ridge going thin and silver. The chill crept in and made her tuck her chin into the collar of her jacket. She sat up with a small grunt, bones arguing, muscles noting every mile she'd put on in the service and after. The desert at first light was a different country, quiet in a way that felt earned. She carried the lantern inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stood at the sink to watch the world brighten through a film of dust on the window. The ranch assembled itself in honest light. Boards were boards, raw and splintered. Fences were fences, crooked and tired. Corrals were corrals, empty as a missing tooth. There was no path from here that skipped the work. She drank a swallow of water that tasted like pennies and resolved to find the wellhead by noon, the good rope by afternoon, and her brother's old tool chest before the sun got high enough to make a liar out of anyone. She stepped back onto the porch as the first sun laid a stripe across the yard, and without meaning to, turned her eyes toward the northern fence line. Up on a far ridge where the land lifted its shoulder against the sky, something dark stood perfectly still and watched the house. She squinted, hand up to shade her eyes. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. The new light ran along its back like water on stone. Then the ridge heat wavered, and the shape fell back into the day, lost among the brush and the low swells of earth. Claire lowered her hand and felt the first beat of a pulse that wasn't dread. Work first, she told herself. Then you can start asking what's watching you from the edges. The sun had barely cleared the jagged eastern ridge when Claire eased the old ATV out of the shed, its engine coughing like it resented the work. The chill of dawn still clung to the air, though she knew it would burn off fast. She bounced along the rutted track toward the northern fence line, scanning for broken wire or signs of trespass. Coyotes sometimes worried the posts loose. Cattle from neighboring parcels had been known to nose through. She didn't expect anything unusual, just another chore in a list that stretched wider than the horizon. The land up here was rougher, the soil scattered with basalt chunks and scrub cedar that had twisted themselves into stubborn sculptures. The ATV rattled over each ridge and dip until the fence came into sight, a sagging stretch of wire glinting in the new light. She cut the throttle, letting the machine idle while she dismounted to check a leaning post. That was when she saw him. At first he seemed part of the land, dark, motionless, a shape stitched into the seam between sky and stone. Then the wind shifted, teasing his mane, and she caught the ripple of muscle beneath the dappled gray coat. He stood on the rise as if he had been waiting for her, one foreleg bent in a way that hinted at old injury. Yet there was no weakness in the way he held himself, just a stillness so complete it demanded her attention. Claire found herself staring longer than she meant to. The Mustang's head lifted slightly, and his gaze locked with hers across the distance. It wasn't the wide, startled look of a wild thing caught in the open. His eyes were steady, dark pools that seemed to weigh her, as though he'd already decided something about her worth. The desert was full of moments you couldn't explain. This was one of them. She shut off the ATV. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear her own pulse. When she stepped away from the fence, the Mustang turned, not in panic, but with a measured grace, and began to move along the ridge. Every dozen paces, he glanced back, the tilt of his head an unspoken question. "Are you coming?" She hesitated. This was ridiculous. Following a wild horse into the backcountry wasn't on her list today, but curiosity slid its hook in deeper than reason could pry loose. She ducked under the fence, boots crunching on gritty soil, and set out after him. The Mustang led her into a maze of mesquite and juniper, where the ground dipped into hidden washes and rose again into pockets of pale grass. She kept him in sight, never close enough to spook him, but near enough to note the faint hitch in his gait. Whatever had stiffened that leg had healed long ago, leaving behind only a ghost of the injury. His tail swished lazily, scattering flies, and now and then he paused just long enough to be sure she hadn't turned back. After 20 minutes, the trees thinned. Claire stepped into a small clearing and stopped dead. Before her, half swallowed by weeds and thyme, stood a log cabin she didn't know existed. Its roof had caved in on one side, shingles scattered like shed bark. The door leaned open, one hinge clinging stubbornly. The windows were blind with dust. It looked abandoned for decades, yet the clearing around it felt kept somehow, as if something had claimed it and held it in quiet possession. The Mustang stood at the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the shadow line. He flicked an ear toward her, then turned his head toward the cabin, holding the pose until she looked too. When her gaze returned to him, he was already backing away, steps slow, deliberate. She expected him to bolt the instant she moved toward the building, but instead he slipped between two junipers and was gone, the silence folding over the space he'd left. Claire approached the cabin with the caution of someone walking into a half-forgotten dream. The air smelled of dry rot and mouse nests. Sunlight knifed through holes in the roof, laying bright squares on the warped floorboards. A broken chair slumped in one corner. In another, a heap of rusted tools lay under a coat of dust thick enough to record the passage of any living thing. No fresh prints, no sign of recent life. She stood in the doorway, listening. Somewhere out in the brush, a jay scolded. The breeze rattled a loose plank. But there was something else. A feeling, not a sound, like standing at the threshold of a story she hadn't been told yet. She didn't cross the floor, not today. Instead, she stepped back into the light, marking the cabin's location in her mind as precisely as she would a landmark on a mission map. On the walk back to the ATV, she kept glancing toward the ridge. The Mustang was nowhere to be seen, but she had the uneasy sense he was still out there, watching. The desert had a way of folding its secrets in layers, revealing them only to those stubborn or foolish enough to follow. And now, whether she liked it or not, she was caught in the pull of one. The next morning, Claire found herself steering the ATV back toward the northern ridge, her excuse a vague notion of checking the fence again. But the truth was simpler. She wanted another look at that cabin, and maybe, though she wouldn't admit it out loud, another glimpse of the Mustang. The air was already warming, the pale blue sky sharp against the dark green of the junipers. She cut across the same narrow wash, weaving through the mesquite until the clearing came into view. The cabin sat unchanged, as if the night had never passed, still half swallowed by shadows from the trees. But something in the air felt different, less still, almost expectant. She parked the ATV and approached, boots crunching softly on the gravelly soil. At the doorway, she paused again, scanning the gloom inside. A shaft of sunlight struck the far corner, illuminating the dust motes drifting through the air. The scent of old wood and dry rot clung heavy, but beneath it was something new, faint, metallic, and out of place. Blood. Her muscles tightened. She stepped across the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. That was when she saw him. A man lay crumpled on the warped floorboards near the rear wall, one leg twisted awkwardly, a dark stain spreading across the fabric of his pant leg. His head rested against the base of a collapsed shelf, his breathing shallow but steady. The copper tang in the air confirmed her guess. He was bleeding. Claire moved without thinking. Instincts drilled into her long before she ever came back to this ranch. Kneeling beside him, she checked his pulse. Fast, but present. The wound was ugly, a jagged gash along his calf, the fabric torn as if by sharp metal. Flies had already started to gather, and she swatted them away with the edge of her shirt. The man stirred, blinking against the light. His eyes, storm gray, not unlike the Mustang's coat, found hers with confusion. "Who?" His voice rasped dry, the word barely shaped. "Don't talk," she said, already unzipping the side pouch of her ATV kit. She pulled out a sterile bandage, gauze, and a roll of tape. "I'm going to stop the bleeding first." He winced when she peeled back the torn fabric. "Was hiking old mining site." He managed between breaths. "Fell, rusted sheet metal." "That'll do it," she muttered, pressing the gauze into place. "You're lucky you didn't tear an artery." "No signal," he said, as if needing her to understand why he was still here. Bleeding into the dust. Claire secured the dressing with tight, efficient wraps. The bleeding slowed, but he was pale under his sunburn. "You need to get off this leg. Can you stand if I help you?" He gave a half shrug that turned into a grimace. "Name's Ethan," he said, voice low. "Ethan Cole." "Claire Whitmore," she answered automatically, slipping an arm under his shoulders. "Let's get you upright." It took 3 tries and more gritted teeth than either of them liked. But she got him to his feet, bracing most of his weight against her. The short walk to the ATV felt twice as long, the uneven ground threatening to pull them both down. She helped him onto the back seat, securing him as best she could before climbing on herself. The engine roared to life, startling a flock of quail from the brush. As she turned the machine toward home, Claire caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Ash stood there, half hidden among the junipers, head high, eyes fixed on them. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched until the ATV lurched forward and the trees closed between them. The ride back to the ranch was rough, every bump drawing a hiss from Ethan. She kept her eyes on the trail, but in her mind, the image of the Mustang lingered, silent, still, as if overseeing their departure. By the time they reached the porch, sweat streaked Ethan's face and his lips were pale. She helped him inside, clearing a space at the kitchen table. The light through the dusty window caught the silver in his stubble, the lines etched deep around his eyes. She fetched a basin of clean water, iodine, and her better medical kit from the hallway closet. "This is going to sting," she warned, pouring the antiseptic over the wound. He exhaled through clenched teeth but didn't pull away. "You a nurse or something?" "Army medic," she said, wrapping the fresh gauze. "A lifetime ago." Something flickered in his gaze. Recognition, maybe respect. "That explains why you didn't panic." "I saved the panic for later," she replied, taping the bandage in place. "You'll need rest and antibiotics." Lucky for you, I've got both. When she finally stepped back, his breathing had eased. Why were you up there anyway? She asked, curious despite herself. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the open door, as if he could still see the clearing. Photography, he said after a pause. Old history. Places people forget. Claire followed his gaze. Remembering the Mustang's deliberate retreat, she didn't mention it. Not yet. Outside, the desert wind shifted, rattling the porch boards. Somewhere far off, a horse whinnied. A low, haunting sound that carried across the empty pasture like a thread between them all. The days that followed settled into a slow rhythm, dictated less by the clock than by the desert's unspoken rules. Ethan's injured leg kept him anchored to the porch, a vantage point that offered a wide sweep of the yard, the corrals, and the distant ridgelines. Claire moved through the spaces between, mending fences, clearing debris from the barn, dragging sun-bleached boards into neat stacks for later use. She found herself checking on him more than she'd intended. At first, it was under the excuse of changing his dressings or making sure he'd eaten something. But in the quiet moments, when she brought him coffee at sunrise or sat across from him on the porch with a sandwich at midday, conversation began to flow in cautious threads. Ethan was a man who carried his history the way the desert carried its scars, weathered into the surface, impossible to erase, but softened at the edges. He told her about the years he'd spent as a firefighter in Flagstaff, the camaraderie, the relentless heat of summer blazes. His voice went quieter when he spoke of the flash flood that had taken his wife, a sudden wall of water in a canyon where they'd been hiking. He didn't dwell on the details, and she didn't press. Claire offered her own fragments in return. The tours overseas as an army medic, the faces she remembered, the ones she wished she could forget. The arguments with her brother, sharp-edged words that had pushed her out the door and kept her from coming back for 12 long years. She admitted, reluctantly, that she hadn't even returned for their father's funeral. Most days, the desert itself seemed to listen. The wind carried their voices away over the pasture, folding them into the same air that held the rustle of mesquite leaves and the creak of the windmill. On the third evening, Claire caught sight of movement in the distance. Ash stood at the far edge of the property, grazing near the dry creek bed. Even from here, the Mustang's outline was unmistakable. The proud arch of his neck, the dapple gray hide broken by shadows. She stilled, watching him between the fence posts. Ethan followed her gaze. "That your horse?" he asked. "Wild," she said. "Been hanging around since I got here." "Funny," Ethan murmured. "Almost looks like he's keeping watch." The thought had crossed her mind, though she didn't voice it. The Mustang never came too close, never acted spooked, but always seemed to appear when something in her life shifted, first on the ridge, then at the cabin, and now again with Ethan sitting on her porch. Later that night, after she'd finished the last of the dishes, Claire found Ethan leaning on the porch rail, the lamplight behind him casting his face in shadow. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Desert's louder than I expected," he said with a small smile. "Coyotes, owls, wind through the wire. You hear things differently when you're stuck in one place." She joined him, the boards cool beneath her bare feet. The sky overhead was a black bowl spilled with stars, the Milky Way a pale ribbon stretching toward the horizon. She found herself speaking without planning to. "When I left, I thought I was saving myself from wasting my life here. But lately, I keep wondering if I just ran away from what scared me. Staying put. Being needed." Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Sometimes running feels like survival. Doesn't mean you can't turn around later. The words landed heavier than she expected. She thought of her brother's face the last time she'd seen him, the way his voice had cracked under his anger. By morning, she decided to tackle the stretch of South Corral fence that had been sagging for years. Ethan insisted on helping, even from his seat. She brought him a bucket of nails and the smaller hammer, and he took to straightening bent ones while she worked the posts. Now and then he'd call out advice or a joke, and she'd answer without looking up, their voices carrying easily across the yard. Around midday, she paused to wipe the sweat from her brow and saw Ash again, closer this time, standing just beyond the fence line. His ears twitched, eyes fixed on them, and for a moment she could swear there was recognition there. "You think he's curious?" Ethan asked, noticing her distraction. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe he's just reminding me he's out there." The Mustang flicked his tail once, as if in answer, then turned toward the open desert. Within seconds, his form dissolved into heat shimmer and distance, leaving only the empty fence line and the lingering sense that something about his timing was never accidental. That evening, as they settled into the porch chairs with mugs of strong coffee, Claire realized the air between them had changed. They were no longer just caretaker and patient, or two strangers thrown together by chance. Loss had built a bridge between them, narrow, fragile, but real. And though neither of them said it outright, the sight of that wild horse on the horizon had become a kind of unspoken reminder. Sometimes the things that come into your life uninvited are the ones that end up leading you where you need to go. It started as a copper haze on the far horizon, a smudge against the otherwise clean line where the desert met the sky. Claire noticed it mid-morning while hauling a coil of barbed wire out to the west pasture. At first, she thought it was just a dust devil spinning itself into nothing, but the haze kept widening, darkening, thickening. The wind shifted, fast and hot, carrying with it a dry rasp that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Ethan, sitting on the porch with his leg propped up, shaded his eyes. "That's not just wind," he called. "No," Claire said, already coiling the wire tighter. "It's a wall." By the time she jogged back to the house, the light had changed. Thick, dim, and wrong. Sandstorms didn't knock politely. They came in sudden, violent sweeps, and this one was closing fast. She ducked inside to grab goggles, a bandana, and the handheld radio. The signal was scratchy, but a voice broke through. "Search and rescue. Family of 3 lost off Highway 71. White SUV, no visibility." She glanced toward Ethan, who was already pushing himself upright with his good leg. "Don't even think about it," she told him. "You can't be out in that." "Then you're going alone?" he asked. "I'll be fine." She was halfway to the ATV when movement caught her eye, out beyond the pasture, against the approaching wall of grit. Ash. The Mustang was trotting directly into the wind, mane whipped back, tail streaming. Every few strides he turned his head to look toward her, then kept going, fighting the gusts. It was deliberate, unmistakable, like the ridge all over again. Claire's gut made the decision before her head caught up. She kicked the ATV into gear and followed, steering toward the direction Ash had taken. Visibility dropped to 50 yards, then 20. The grit stung her skin, found its way past the bandana, turned her breath dry and shallow. She kept her eyes on the shadowy figure of the Mustang ahead, his dapple gray shape flickering in and out of the murk. They pushed deeper into the storm. The wind howled around her helmet, a low, steady roar. Sand hissed against the ATV's frame, filling the air with a constant rasp. Twice she nearly lost sight of Ash, only for him to reappear just ahead, glancing back before pressing on. Finally, the shape of a vehicle emerged, a white SUV half buried in drifts, its tires sunken, the windshield smeared with grit. Claire skidded to a stop, tossed the goggles onto her forehead, and ran to the driver's side. Inside, a man in his 40s gripped the wheel, knuckles pale. Beside him, a woman shielded a young boy against her side. Their faces were drawn tight with fear. "Search and rescue," Claire shouted over the wind, though it wasn't exactly a lie. "We've got to move. Now." The man fumbled for the handle, and she yanked the door open, bracing it against the gusts. One by one, she got them out, guiding them toward the ATV, the boy's small hand clamped onto her arm like a vice. She settled the boy between his parents on the back rack, looping her spare tie-downs to keep them steady. "Hold on to each other and don't let go," she ordered, her voice hoarse from the grit. Ash stood just beyond the ATV, the storm swirling around him. As she revved the engine, he pivoted and started back the way they'd come, head low against the wind. Claire followed. The trip back was a fight. Each gust threatened to shove them sideways, every patch of soft sand another trap. But Ash never faltered. When the path split around a low rise, he chose the firmer ground, leading them along a shallow wash that offered some shelter from the worst of the wind. By the time the ranch house emerged from the murk, Claire's shoulders burned from holding the handlebars steady. She pulled up in front of the porch, and Ethan was already hobbling down the steps, a blanket in his hands. They got the family inside, shut the door against the storm's howl. The boy clung to his mother, eyes wide as he took in the dim kitchen, the lantern on the table, the dust-streaked woman who'd dragged them out of the storm. The man found his voice first. You just showed up. How?" Claire glanced toward the window, where the storm pressed against the glass in shifting waves of tan and gold. "I had a guide," she said. When she stepped back onto the porch, Ash was gone, vanished into the wall of dust like he'd never been there at all. But she could still see him in her mind, steady and sure-footed, glancing back to make sure she kept up. By the next morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the yard layered in fine, powdery sand. Word had already traveled to town. People came by with extra water, blankets, and curiosity, their voices carrying the same phrase, "The ghost Mustang." Claire didn't correct them. She just looked toward the northern ridge, wondering if Ash would ever let her close enough to know for sure why he kept showing up when someone needed saving. The desert had its own way of telling you when it was time to return somewhere. For Claire, that call came in the form of a stubborn thought that wouldn't leave her alone, a pull back to the old cabin where she'd first found Ethan. 2 weeks had passed since the sandstorm rescue. The family was safely back on the road. The townsfolk had stopped dropping by with just one more question about the Mustang, and the days had fallen into a rhythm again. Ethan's leg was healing enough that he could manage short walks with a cane, though she still caught him testing the weight on it when he thought she wasn't looking. That morning, over coffee, she said, "I'm going to check the cabin, see if it's worth saving." Ethan looked up from the mug he was turning in his hands. "You mean the one where you found me half dead?" "That's the one." She gave a dry smile. "Figure I should see what's still holding it together before the next storm knocks it over completely." "I'll go with you," he said without hesitation. "You sure? It's a rough trail." He tapped the cane leaning beside his chair. "Not my first rough trail. I'll manage." They loaded the ATV with a broom, gloves, a pry bar, and a pair of dust masks. The ride out was slow, both to spare Ethan's leg and because the ground was still soft in places from the storm. Ash didn't appear this time, though Claire caught herself scanning the ridges out of habit. The cabin stood just as they'd left it. Half-collapsed roof, door hanging crooked, weeds pressing against the outer walls. Inside, the air was cooler than outside, but heavy with the smell of damp wood and thyme. Sunlight streamed through the roof's gaps in narrow, shifting columns, catching the floating dust. They started by clearing debris, broken chair legs, splintered planks, an old stove door rusted nearly through. Every so often, Ethan would pause, leaning on the broom handle, and they'd trade guesses about who might have lived here, how long ago, and why they'd left. It was while sweeping near the far wall that Claire's boot caught on something. She looked down to see one floorboard slightly raised, warped enough to snag her sole. "Hold on," she said, crouching. She tested it with her fingertips, loose. She worked the pry bar into the seam, the nails groaning as they gave way. The board lifted with a reluctant sigh, revealing a narrow gap beneath. Something wrapped in oilcloth sat wedged between two joists. "What do you think that is?" Ethan asked, his voice low despite the emptiness around them. "Only one way to find out." She reached in, the dust tickling her throat, and hauled the bundle into the light. The oilcloth was stiff with age, edges frayed. She unwrapped it carefully, layer by layer, until a rusted metal box emerged, small enough to carry in one hand, heavy with whatever it held. The latch crumbled at her touch. Inside, there were leather-bound journals, their covers worn but intact, pages yellowed and faintly brittle. She opened the top one and began to read. The handwriting was looping and deliberate. The ink faded to brown. June 14th, 1879. Samuel and I arrived at last. The land is raw and wild, but it feels like the beginning of something worth the labor. Entry after entry spoke of building a home from nothing, hauling water from the creek, splitting logs for the cabin walls, planting a garden that the desert fought them for every inch. But alongside the hardship were words of quiet triumph, of shared meals by lamplight, of a love that seemed to anchor them against every dust storm and drought. Claire felt the edges of her chest tighten. These were strangers, long gone. Yet their words hummed with something she recognized, the hope of belonging somewhere, the stubborn refusal to be driven away. Ethan had pulled up a crate to sit on, leaning forward to read over her shoulder. "They sound like they were in it together," he said. "Yeah," she murmured, "all the way to the end." The last entries were shorter, shakier, mentions of illness, of nights spent listening for coyotes too close to the livestock, of a winter so cold the water buckets froze solid indoors. The final line, written in a hand that trembled, "If we can just make it to spring." There were no more pages after that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the years pressing in around them. Outside, the wind shifted through the junipers, carrying the dry whisper of leaves. Claire closed the journal and set it back in the box. "We should keep these safe," she said. "Feels wrong to just leave them here to rot." Ethan nodded. "And maybe, if we fix this place up, we can put them back. Let people read them, keep their story alive." It wasn't the first time she'd thought about rebuilding the cabin, but now the idea had roots. She could almost see it. Repaired walls, a roof that kept the weather out, a space for others to stop and breathe before pushing on. As they packed up to leave, Claire glanced toward the tree line. For a split second, she thought she saw Ash's silhouette on the ridge, just where sunlight broke through the clouds. By the time she blinked, it was gone. But she carried the image with her all the way back to the ranch, along with the box of journals resting between her boots, a reminder that sometimes the land kept its own kind of memory, waiting for the right hands to uncover it. They returned to the cabin just 3 days later, driven by the same quiet urgency that had followed them home with the journals. This time, Claire came armed with extra tools, crowbars, a sturdy rope, and a plan to search beneath the rest of the floor for anything the pioneer couple might have left behind. Ethan, still moving with a limp but steadier than before, insisted on coming along. The sky was washed in pale morning light when they arrived. The air held that early stillness before the desert began to shimmer with heat. Inside, dust motes spun lazily through slanted beams of sunlight. They had already cleared one side of the room, so Claire focused on the far corner, where the boards sagged the most. "Start slow," Ethan cautioned as she knelt with the pry bar. "That wood's been holding its grudges for 100 years. Better it take them out on me than collapse under someone else later," she said, wedging the tool beneath a warped plank. Nails shrieked as they pulled free. One by one, she stacked the loose boards to the side, exposing dry earth beneath. Nothing. Just as she was about to move on, the wood beneath her left knee gave a sharp crack. It happened fast, too fast for her to react. The rotted beam beneath gave way, and she dropped through the hole with a thud that rattled her teeth. Pain shot through her shoulder as she landed half-twisted in the shallow crawl space. Splinters scraped her arms, and the dust made her cough hard enough to blur her vision. "Claire." Ethan's voice was sharp, his cane clattering to the floor as he scrambled toward the opening. He knelt at the jagged edge, face pale. "Talk to me. Are you hurt?" "My shoulder," she managed, trying to push herself up. Pain flared hot and immediate, locking her breath. "I think something's pinned me." She glanced down and saw the culprit, a heavy section of timber, likely part of the collapsed support beam, wedged across her torso. She could move her legs, but her left arm was trapped tight, the ache deepening by the second. Ethan braced himself and tried to shift the beam, muscles straining. It didn't budge more than an inch. "Damn it," he muttered. "It's too heavy for me alone." Claire gritted her teeth. "Then go get leverage, rope, anything." He hesitated, scanning the open doorway. "I'll find something." But before he could move, a sound cut through the stillness. A sharp snort, followed by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. They grew louder, closer, until a shadow moved across the sunlight streaming through the cabin's doorway. Ash. The Mustang stood just beyond the threshold, ears pricked, nostrils flaring as if he'd caught their urgency in the air. His dark eyes flicked from Ethan to the gap in the floor where Claire lay. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted. Ethan stared after him, baffled. "Guess we scared him off." Claire shook her head. "No, he's doing something." Minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last. Dust sifted down from the cabin ceiling as she tried to shift her body without making the pain worse. Just when she thought Ethan might have to leave her to get help, the sound came again. Hoofbeats, but more than one set this time. Two figures appeared in the doorway, blinking against the change from sun to shadow. A man and a woman, both carrying day packs and hiking poles. They looked startled to see Ethan, more startled still when they spotted Claire in the crawl space. "She's stuck," Ethan said quickly. "We need all hands to lift this beam." The hikers dropped their packs and stepped forward without hesitation. One braced beside Ethan, the other crouched near Claire's trapped arm. "On 3, Ethan said, his voice taut. 1, 2, 3. The beam lifted, just enough for Claire to roll free. She scrambled up with their help, her left arm cradled close, the ache throbbing deep but blessedly free. She met the eyes of the hikers, breathless. "You have no idea how glad I am to see you." "Your horse found us," the woman said, still catching her breath. "Came right up to us on the trail and wouldn't leave. Kept walking a few steps, looking back, then trotting ahead again until we followed him here." Claire's gaze darted to the doorway, but Ash was gone, vanished into the desert as if he'd never been there at all. They stepped outside into the brightness, the hikers lingering long enough to make sure she was steady on her feet. Claire flexed her fingers carefully, testing her range of motion. It wasn't broken, but she knew she'd be nursing the injury for a while. As they started the slow trip back to the ATV, Ethan broke the silence. "You were right. He's not just wandering." "No," Claire said, glancing at the ridge in the distance. "Ash knows exactly when to show up." The desert wind swept past them, carrying the faintest sound of hoofbeats fading into the open land. A reminder that somewhere out there, the Mustang was already moving on to whatever came next. Claire's shoulder ached for days after the fall, a deep, stubborn throb that made even simple chores slow. She hated slowing down, but the truth was, her body left her no choice. Ethan, still nursing his leg, turned the porch into a sort of planning station. 2 chairs, a stack of notebooks, and a growing pile of ideas about what the cabin could become. At first, their talk was practical. How to shore up the foundation, which beams would need replacing, where they could source reclaimed lumber without breaking the bank. But as the hours passed, the vision started to stretch beyond the boards and nails. "It doesn't have to just be a cabin," Ethan said one afternoon, leaning forward in his chair. "It could be a place for people to stop, not just hikers, anyone who needs a bed and a roof for a night." Claire sipped her coffee, studying the way the late sun lit the dust drifting in the air. "A safe place in the middle of nowhere," she murmured. "Exactly," he said. "Somewhere you can catch your breath before you figure out your next step. We could call it—" He hesitated, then grinned. "Haven's Rest." The name settled between them like it had been waiting there all along. Word spread quickly once they told a few folks in town. Some came out of curiosity, some out of genuine interest, and some because they'd heard the stories about the ghost Mustang leading people to safety. Whatever the reason, people started showing up with what they could spare: an old box of nails, a half-used can of paint, tools they no longer needed. The first workday felt almost like a barn raising from another century. Trucks rolled up in a cloud of dust, doors slammed, and people spilled out carrying hammers, saws, and coolers full of ice water. Claire stood on the edge of the clearing for a moment, taking it all in. The laughter, the sound of saws biting into wood, the steady rhythm of nails driven home. Ethan coordinated from a camp chair, sketching rough diagrams and pointing people toward tasks that matched their skills. Claire floated between groups, offering a hand where she could, her shoulder protesting every time she lifted something heavier than a hammer. But the work filled her with a kind of quiet energy she hadn't felt in years. By midday, the air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut lumber and the metallic tang of old nails meeting new boards. The collapsed section of roof was stripped and framed anew, sunlight catching on the bright heads of the nails like little sparks. Inside, volunteers swept years of dust and debris into piles, the sound of bristles on old wood blending with the occasional burst of conversation. A teenage boy from town, barely old enough to shave, stood on the porch steps holding one of the pioneer journals they'd found. "This is really cool," he said, thumbing the worn pages. "You should put these out when it's done. People would want to read them." "That's the plan," Claire said, taking the book gently from his hands. "These stories are part of the place now." As the sun began to sink, long shadows stretched across the clearing. The day's work was far from finished, but progress was undeniable. The cabin no longer looked like something the desert was trying to reclaim. It looked like something people had claimed back. That evening, after the last truck pulled away and the quiet returned, Claire and Ethan sat side by side on the new porch steps. The air was cooling fast, the desert wind soft against their faces. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called, its voice threading through the gathering dark. And then she saw him. Ash stood on the far slope, his dapple gray coat catching the last fire of the sunset. He didn't move closer. He never did. But he lingered longer than usual, head slightly raised, ears angled forward. It felt somehow like approval. Ethan followed her gaze. "Think he knows this is for him too?" "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe he just likes to keep an eye on things." They sat there until the Mustang turned away, disappearing into the folds of shadow and scrub. Claire felt something settle in her chest. Not closure exactly, but the steady weight of purpose. Haven's Rest wasn't just going to be a building. It was going to be a promise. And somehow, she thought Ash understood that better than anyone. Haven's Rest opened without fanfare. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, just the quiet swing of the cabin's new door on its oiled hinges and the scent of fresh pine still lingering in the beams. But word spread fast. Out here, it didn't take a billboard or an ad. It took one person telling another that there was a place where you could stop, no questions asked, and find warmth, a meal, and a bed for the night. The first to arrive was a weathered man named Bill, a Vietnam veteran who'd been hitching his way to Tucson, but got stranded when his ride broke down. He stood in the doorway with a cautious look, as if waiting to be told to keep moving. Claire ushered him in, poured him coffee, and showed him the narrow bunk by the corner window. He stayed 2 nights, leaving behind a folded scrap of paper tucked into the journal on the hearth. The note simply read, "Still here, still fighting. Thank you." Others followed. Drifters, day hikers caught out longer than they'd planned. A young mother and her daughter whose car had given up 30 miles from the nearest town. Each person added their own mark to the journal. A few lines, sometimes just a name. Sometimes whole paragraphs of thanks or memories stirred by the cabin's rough-hewn walls. The journal grew fat quickly, its pages carrying the scrawl of countless hands. Some entries mentioned Ash directly. Sightings on the ridge, the sound of hoofbeats just before help arrived, the uncanny way he seemed to show up when someone was lost. People began to speak of him like an old frontier ghost, a guardian of the desert who guided the weary to safety. Ethan took to reading the entries aloud in the evenings when the cabin was empty, his voice slow and steady. Claire would listen from the porch, the sound blending with the crackle of the fire inside. "Feels like we're collecting more than stories," he said one night. "Feels like we're stitching people together, even if they never meet." Life at Haven's Rest took on its own rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the low hum of the windmill turning in the breeze. Afternoons were for repairs, small improvements, and the occasional trip into town for supplies. Evenings brought quiet conversation, or the simple companionship of shared silence. Ash was never predictable, but his appearances followed a strange logic. Sometimes Claire would spot him at dusk, a shadow against the burning horizon. Other times, his hoofprints would be the only sign he'd been near, fresh marks in the sand by the fence, or a single print in the hard-packed earth near the water trough. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft snorts just beyond the porch. By the time she stepped outside, the yard was empty, but she could still feel the echo of his presence. They never tried to catch him. Neither of them wanted to. He wasn't meant to be haltered or broken. His freedom was part of what made his presence so powerful. The people who came to Haven's Rest didn't need a petting zoo. They needed the idea of something wild still watching over them. Years began to pass in the slow, deliberate way the desert measures time. The journals multiplied, lined up neatly on a shelf by the hearth. Each was marked with the span of dates it covered, their spines worn soft from handling. Claire would sometimes run her fingers along them like counting old friends. She noticed changes in herself, too. The ranch that had once felt like a burden now felt like an anchor. The work was still endless. Fences to mend, tools to sharpen, leaks to patch. But it no longer felt like work she was doing alone. Ethan's presence had become steady and familiar, his quiet way of filling the spaces between them without crowding her. Their bond wasn't something they named or rushed. It was built in the same way they'd built Haven's Rest, board by board, day by day. And always, in the distance, there was Ash. Sometimes weeks would pass without a glimpse, and then he'd appear on the ridge like he'd never left, head lifted to the wind. Claire wondered if he knew the scope of what he'd set in motion the day he'd led her to Ethan. One evening, a storm broke over the desert, sheets of rain hammering the roof, the air thick with the scent of wet mesquite. Claire stood in the doorway, watching the lightning dance over the ridges. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw him out there. A dark figure against the silver flash, unmoving in the downpour. And even though she knew it might have been nothing more than a trick of the light, she lifted her hand in silent thanks. Haven's Rest had become more than a shelter. It was a place people left with lighter steps than when they'd arrived, a waypoint in the vast and unforgiving sweep of the desert. And in its quiet corners, in the scribbled notes, the repaired beams, the memories pressed into every board, was proof that no one was ever too lost to be found. The desert had turned gold that evening, the kind of light that stretched shadows long and painted every stone and scrub in shades of fire. Claire stood on the porch of Haven's Rest, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Inside, lanterns glowed, casting warm halos against the cabin walls. Laughter drifted through the open door, 3 hikers swapping stories with an old ranch hand who'd arrived the night before, their voices blending with the crackle of the wood stove. She took a step back, letting the sound wash over her. This was what she and Ethan had built. Not just a structure, but a place that felt alive, even when the people inside were strangers to each other. The cabin was a small beacon in a vast and often unforgiving land, its light visible from the ridges long before a traveler reached the clearing. Ethan came to stand beside her, leaning against the rail with a contented sigh. "Doesn't get much better than this," he said, nodding toward the open door. "No," Claire agreed. "It doesn't." They watched the sky darken together, the horizon melting into deep orange, then purple. As the last of the light began to fade, she saw him, Ash, on the northern ridge, his silhouette sharp against the dying sun. He stood motionless, tail flicking once, ears angled toward the cabin as though listening. Claire felt the familiar pull in her chest. She stepped down into the yard, boots crunching softly on the packed earth, until she was clear of the porch light. The wind carried the faint scent of creosote and cooling sand. "You've been there from the start," she said into the open air, "when I didn't even know what I was looking for." It wasn't the kind of confession she'd planned to make, but the words felt right. She didn't expect him to hear her, not in the way people hear each other. Yet something about his stillness made her believe he understood. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with the slow grace of a creature entirely unbound, Ash turned, stepping away from the ridgeline. The last light caught along his back before he disappeared into the folds of shadow. All that remained were the faint prints his hooves had pressed into the earth, a trail already softening under the wind. Claire stood there until the stars came out. When she finally turned back toward the cabin, the glow from inside seemed brighter, warmer. She thought of all the names and notes in the journals, the stories etched into these walls by people who had arrived burdened and left a little lighter. Haven's Rest had become a promise, one that she intended to keep for as long as she had the strength to hold it. Later, as she settled into one of the porch chairs, Ethan handed her a fresh mug of coffee. "You see him again?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "He was up on the ridge." Ethan's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Guess he's still keeping watch." They didn't speak after that, content to listen to the desert's night music, the distant yip of coyotes, the low whistle of wind through the fence wire, the muted laughter from inside. The Milky Way arched overhead, clear and bright, as if the whole sky had opened up to watch with them. When the last of the guests turned in for the night, Claire rose to check the lanterns, each one glowing steady in its place. Through the window, the fire in the wood stove burned low but sure, throwing shifting patterns on the walls. She paused with her hand on the doorframe, looking out toward the dark ridges. Ash was gone now, but the sense of him lingered, not as a constant presence, but as a reminder that sometimes the right guide shows up only when you need them most. And in the stillness that followed, she felt it. The ranch, the cabin, the desert itself, all bound together in a quiet kind of understanding. Haven's Rest wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to the land, to the people who found it, and maybe in some way, to the Mustang who had led her here in the first place. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the faintest whisper of hoofbeats that might have been memory. Claire closed the door gently behind her, the light spilling out onto the porch like a welcome that would never end.